You ever stopped and thought about how much energy it actually takes to train one of those AI models everyone's talking about?
I can imagine it's a lot.
It's wild. A huge appetite for energy. And we're only going to need more and more as time goes on.
Yeah, for sure. As those AI models keep getting bigger and more complex, they're going to need a whole lot more juice to run. We actually looked this up. There are projections that say AI's energy demands could jump 160% by 2030.
Goldman Sachs estimated that. Think about trying to get all that just from solar panels and wind turbines. It'd be pretty tough to keep up.
Yeah, definitely not easy being green. Speaking of, we've got all these big tech companies, and they're always talking about going green, fighting climate change, all that. But they might actually end up using, well, nuclear energy to do it. It is kind of funny how these things are all coming together now. You've got big tech feeling the heat to shrink their carbon footprint and all. But at the same time, they need more and more power for this AI stuff. So that's where nuclear energy comes in.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's consistent. It's carbon-free when it's running. It kind of checks a lot of boxes.
I guess the big question is, why nuclear?
Well, solar and wind power, they're great and all, but they're not always there for you. Sun goes down, the wind dies down. But nuclear, that's like having a reliable friend who always has your back no matter what, 24/7. And data centers, those things are the backbone of AI. They got to be up and running all the time, no breaks. Nuclear can handle that.
That's true. It's a pretty good match when you think about it.
And we can't forget about those emissions. Data centers are popping up everywhere, and all those servers use a ton of energy. Nuclear power actually helps address that. It could even help these companies do even better than their climate goals.
I mean, we've seen reports that Microsoft, Google, Amazon, their emissions are actually going up even though they're talking about sustainability.
And that leads us to something really interesting. Microsoft is actually teaming up with, wait for it, 3 Mile Island.
Oh, wow. Had to come up eventually, right? We couldn't do a deep dive on this without talking about the elephant in the room.
Right.
3 Mile Island. You say the name and people think meltdown. It's like going back to the scene of the crime, but instead of investigating, you're building something new.
That 1979 accident really stuck with people, made them really wary of nuclear power.
To be fair, though, we're not talking about bringing back the same reactor that caused all the trouble. Microsoft's focused on a different unit there, Unit 1. The Guardian article mentioned that they're changing the plant's name to Crane Clean Energy Center.
It's interesting, right? They're choosing a name that pushes clean energy. They're definitely trying to change how people see it.
So what are the details on this whole deal? What's the fine print?
So from what we gathered from Reuters, Microsoft is locked in for the long haul. They signed a 20-year power purchase agreement with Constellation Energy, which owns the plant. We're talking a cool $1.6 billion to get Unit 1 back up and running, and it should be online by 2028.
They're not just dipping their toes in the water. They're doing a full cannonball into the nuclear pool.
Yeah, it's a huge commitment for sure. It just shows how important clean and reliable energy is to them. And it's not just about what they need now. They're thinking about the future of AI development. They know that as AI keeps growing, it'll need even more energy.
Right. So Microsoft is all in on nuclear, but they're not the only ones, right?
Mm-hmm.
Didn't Amazon make some moves in the nuclear department too?
Yep, they did. Amazon Web Services, they don't want to be left behind. They just made a deal to buy power from the Susquehanna nuclear plant in Pennsylvania. It's a big one, the 6th largest in the entire U.S.
Wow. Okay. So it's not just Microsoft. It's becoming a trend in big tech.
Definitely seems that way.
So Microsoft's got 3 Mile Island. Amazon's hooked up with Susquehanna. What's next? Is Google going to buy Chernobyl?
Well, Google's got something up their sleeve. They're looking into something called small modular reactors, or SMRs for short.
SMRs, huh? So instead of these huge nuclear power plants we're used to seeing, we're talking about mini reactors. Like, how small are we talking?
Yeah, they're definitely smaller, not quite small enough to fit in your backyard or anything.
Okay, good to know.
About 1/10 to 1/4 the size of the traditional ones. They're all about being flexible and getting things up and running faster.
Okay, so like the tiny house version of a nuclear power plant. But why go small? What's the advantage there?
Adaptability. You could potentially build these SMRs off-site and then just ship them wherever they're needed. Cuts down on construction time, cuts down on costs. Plus, they'd be easier to connect to the existing power grids.
Makes sense. So we could have a bunch of these smaller, more efficient SMRs placed strategically around to power, well, everything.
It's an attractive idea, but SMR tech is still in the early stages. There are still challenges to work out. There's still a ton of complicated engineering and safety stuff involved. Plus, they got to make financial sense, right? They got to be able to compete with other energy sources, including those big nuclear plants we were just talking about. which is no easy feat.
Right, of course. And then there's the whole how do people feel about it factor. Even if these SMRs are as safe as can be.
Yeah, that's a big one. Public perception is huge. And it's not just about safety either. People are worried about the waste, security risks, the whole history of the nuclear industry, all of it.
It's a lot to deal with. But let's get back to these deals with the existing plants for a sec. Amazon's agreement with the Susquehanna plant, that one caused a bit of a stir, didn't it?
It did. The deal itself is a big deal, but it also got people talking. The Verge had a good article about it. They talked about how some consumer groups in Pennsylvania are worried that this partnership could mean higher electricity prices for everyone else. You've got big tech, they need their energy. You've got people who live near these plants worried about costs and the environment. And then you've got the regulators trying to make everyone happy. And don't forget about the power companies themselves. They've got to find their place in all of this, too.
It's like a giant game of energy Jenga.
Yeah.
Everyone trying to grab what they need without knocking the whole thing over. Speaking of, bringing a plant like 3 Mile Island back online, even just part of it, that's got to be a legal and regulatory nightmare.
Oh, yeah. Restarting a nuclear reactor, even one with a good track record, you're talking permits, inspections, public hearings.
They got to convince everyone, the regulators, the people who live there, probably a whole army of lawyers, that it's safe, it's needed, and it makes financial sense.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
We've covered a lot of ground here. It's clear that big tech is placing a huge bet on nuclear to power their future. But it's not without its hurdles, that's for sure.
It's like they're playing a double game.
Yeah, 2 different strategies.
On one side, you've got companies like Microsoft and Amazon. They're cutting deals with these big nuclear plants that already exist. They need that constant, reliable power, the base load power. And nuclear can provide that without the carbon emissions. Then you got Google. They're thinking even further ahead, looking at those SMRs, the small modular reactors. It's a story that's still unfolding, and the ending is far from written. Will big tech's embrace of nuclear power lead to a nuclear resurgence, or will it be too much to overcome? We'll have to wait and see.
That's the big question. And on that note, we're going to have to wrap up this deep dive into the world of big tech and nuclear power. Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deep.